Now, one rule with making solutions, particularly aqueous solutions or non-aqueous solutions, is that like dissolves like. What does that mean? Well, it means that if you have a polar solvent, it will dissolve polar solutes. And if you have a nonpolar solvent, it will dissolve nonpolar solutes. And the opposite is true as well. If you have a polar with a nonpolar, they won't form a solution, and a polar with a nonpolar, that will also not form a solution. So if you have polar, you'll get a solution. And if we have nonpolar, we will also get a solution. And if they're not the same, nonpolar, polar, or polar, nonpolar, same difference, then we will not get a solution. They will be separated. And so some examples of like polar would be, say, dissolving isopropyl alcohol in water. Both of those are polar compounds. Or ionic compounds dissolved in water will also dissolve. An example of nonpolar would be like fat-soluble vitamins dissolving in body fat. That's a nonpolar molecule dissolving in nonpolar substance, which is fat. And polar, you won't get a solution. And if you think about salad dressing, particularly Italian dressing, what floats on the top? It's the oil, and what's on the bottom is the vinegar water. Now, the vinegar water is very polar. The oil is not very polar. So the oil doesn't mix with the vinegar water. It doesn't mix. It forms two layers. You have to shake it up, and after you set it down, it separates back out into layers. Now, why does the oil float? Well, the oil floats on top of the water just because it's less dense than the water. But the reason why they don't mix together is because the oil is nonpolar and the vinegar water is very polar. So you have like dissolves like. And so if they're the same, they will dissolve, and if they're different, they will not dissolve in each other.